He was supposed to be invisible. A quiet child standing where he didn't belong, in a house built on power, money, and unspoken rules. When a dying boy stopped breathing, fingers pointed fast, and they didn't point at the doctors who had failed again and again. They pointed at the maid's son. In seconds, help was mistaken for harm and bias spoke louder than truth. But then something changed, something no one in that room could explain. What they saw next would expose how dangerous it can be when prejudice decides who gets believed and who doesn't. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're new here, subscribe to our channel Horovia and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special for you. Before everything shattered, life inside the estate followed a strict, silent rhythm. Power lived in the walls. Money decided what mattered, and people like Tessa learned quickly how to move without being seen. She woke before dawn every day, took 2 buses, and entered the mansion through a side door designed to remind her where she stood. She did her work well, spoke little, and never asked questions, because questions cost jobs. Her son Noah understood this world better than most adults. He learned early that silence was safer than curiosity, that watching was smarter than speaking. While other children filled rooms with noise, Noah filled his mind with patterns. He noticed things people with titles and degrees overlooked. It wasn't talent, it was survival. On the other side of the house lived Ethan Wycliffe, a man who owned cities on paper but couldn't save what mattered most. Since his wife's death, his world had narrowed to one fragile center, his young son, Miles. The doctors came and went, confident and expensive, promising answers that never arrived. With every meal, Miles grew weaker. With every night, Ethan's control slipped further through his fingers. The house held all of them under one roof, separated by class, race, and unspoken rules. No one crossed lines. No one challenged authority. And no one expected the quietest child in the building to notice the one detail everyone else ignored. But something was wrong, and soon that silence, the kind built on fear and hierarchy, was about to turn dangerous. The days that followed grew heavier, as if the house itself sensed what was coming. Every meal became a gamble. Every hour carried a quiet threat. Noah watched from corners and doorways, unseen by those who believed uniforms and titles made them observant. The pattern returned again and again, food delivered with confidence, followed by sickness no one could explain. The doctors blamed rare conditions, stress, bad luck. None of them blamed the system they trusted more than their own eyes. Tessa felt it too, the tension, the way certain glances lingered on her longer than they should, the way mistakes she didn't make were silently assigned to her. She cleaned, cooked, and complied, knowing one wrong step could cost everything. Bringing Noah with her that day already felt like a risk she couldn't afford, but leaving him behind felt worse. In spaces like this, safety was never guaranteed, only negotiated. As Miles weakened, the estate shifted into crisis mode. Security appeared more often. Voices lowered, doors closed faster. Noah noticed how quickly authority filled the room when fear arrived and how easily suspicion followed it, especially toward people who didn't belong. When the boy collapsed again after lunch, the response was immediate but not thoughtful. Panic replaced patience. Orders replaced listening. Noah's certainty grew colder with every episode. This wasn't chance. It wasn't fate. It was something introduced slowly, hidden behind approval forms and expert signatures. He remembered lessons passed down quietly, warnings about substances that harmed over time, about how danger often arrived wearing a trusted face. While professionals argued probabilities, a child connected the dots. The moment everything tipped came fast, too fast for permission. Miles's breathing faltered. His skin burned. The room filled with noise and motion, but no answers. Noah moved before fear could stop him. What he did next broke every unspoken rule of that house. He crossed lines meant to keep people like him invisible, and the response was immediate. Hands grabbed him. Accusations filled the air. Help was reframed as harm in seconds. In that moment, the room made a decision: not based on evidence but on who he was and where he came from. Authority closed ranks. Guilt was assigned without question. Tessa's worst fear unfolded in front of her eyes, powerless to stop it. Then something unexpected happened. The chaos paused, not silence but hesitation. The kind that arrives when reality refuses to match assumptions. Monitors shifted, movements slowed, people noticed what they hadn't been looking for, and the truth, long ignored, pushed its way into the room. Noah was being pulled away when the first sign appeared. Subtle, easy to miss, but once seen, impossible to unsee. And in that fragile pause between blame and understanding, the house stood on the edge of a revelation that would force everyone inside to confront an uncomfortable question. How close had prejudice come to destroying the very life they were trying to save? The hesitation didn't last long, but it was enough to crack the certainty everyone had been hiding behind. A nurse glanced at the monitor again, then once more, slower this time. Her brow tightened. Another staff member leaned closer, unsure why the numbers no longer matched the panic in the room. The story they had already decided on was starting to slip. Still, momentum is dangerous when fear and bias take control. Security tightened their grip on Noah, convinced they were stopping a threat instead of silencing a warning. Someone shouted that the police were already on their way. Words like assault and liability echoed through the sunroom, louder than reason. In moments like this, truth rarely wins quickly, power does. Tessa's voice broke through the noise, raw and desperate. She tried to explain, to remind them of what they had all seen for weeks. The timing, the meals, the pattern no one wanted to document, but her words landed softly and disappeared. She was a maid. In this house, that meant her voice carried no weight. Her fear was treated as inconvenience, her insight as interference. Noah felt the injustice settle deep in his chest, not as panic but as clarity. He had seen this before in smaller ways. Teachers who assumed, strangers who decided who he was before he spoke, authority that listened selectively. He knew, even now, that what was happening wasn't really about what he did. It was about who they believed was capable of harm. Across the room, Miles stirred again, just slightly, a shift in posture, a change in breath, enough to draw a second glance. Then a third. The monitor confirmed what eyes were afraid to trust. Something was different. The crisis wasn't escalating, it was retreating. Confusion crept in where certainty had lived seconds earlier. A doctor hesitated mid-sentence. Another checked the temperature again, slower, more careful. The narrative was unraveling, and no one wanted to be the first to admit it. When Ethan arrived, he walked straight into a scene already poisoned by assumptions. He saw his son weak, his home in chaos, and a stranger's child restrained nearby. The conclusion formed instantly. Power does that. It fills gaps without asking questions. His command cut through the room, sharp and final, reinforcing every fear Tessa had carried since the moment she stepped into that house. But even as blame tightened its grip, reality refused to cooperate. Miles's breathing steadied. The retching stopped completely. The room fell into an uneasy quiet, not peace but disbelief, the kind that precedes a reckoning. And as Noah was pulled toward the door, one last detail emerged, small, undeniable, and impossible to explain away. It was the kind of detail that forces people to confront not just a mistake, but a bias they'd never admitted out loud. The question was no longer what just happened. It was who nearly paid the price for being ignored. The room didn't know how to breathe anymore. Every sound felt out of place. The hum of equipment, the shuffle of shoes, the faint gasp someone tried to hide. People who moments earlier spoke with certainty now avoided eye contact, as if looking too closely might force them to admit what they'd done. The version of events they had clung to was collapsing, and fear rushed in to replace it. Ethan stood frozen, caught between instinct and evidence. For the first time since he'd entered the room, he really looked, not at the boy being restrained, but at his son. Miles's chest rose and fell in a steadier rhythm. Color returned slowly, uneven but unmistakable. This wasn't the body of a child getting worse. This was a child pulling back from the edge. A nurse whispered something to a doctor. The doctor didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the screen, recalculating, replaying the last few minutes in his mind. Authority doesn't like being wrong, especially in front of witnesses, especially when the truth points in an uncomfortable direction. Tessa remained where she was, shaking, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She didn't move toward her son. She didn't dare. One wrong step could turn suspicion back into certainty. All she could do was watch as the room slowly realized it might have made a terrible mistake. Noah, still held at the edge of the space, noticed everything. The shift in posture, the hesitation before orders, the silence where accusations had been. He understood this moment better than anyone, that fragile window when the powerful decide whether to double down or finally listen. Miles moved again. This time it was undeniable. His head turned slightly, following motion in the room. A quiet gasp escaped someone near the window. Another staff member raised a hand without thinking, then froze as Miles's eyes tracked it, not randomly, intentionally. The effect was instant. Conversation stopped mid-breath. The weight of what they were seeing pressed down on everyone at once. For weeks they had said this couldn't happen, that the damage was done, that nothing could change without drastic intervention. And yet here it was, change unfolding right in front of them. Ethan felt something break open inside him. Not relief yet, not gratitude, something sharper. The realization that while experts debated and authority dominated, a child with no credentials had acted and been punished for it. The story the room wanted to tell itself was gone. In its place stood an uncomfortable truth. The wrong person had been restrained, the wrong voice ignored, and the wrong assumptions trusted. And as the final pieces began to fall into place, one question lingered, heavy and unavoidable. How many warnings had been missed simply because they came from someone no one thought was worth listening to? The moment broke open all at once. What had been chaos turned into a sharp, unbearable stillness, the kind that forces truth into the open. The child on the couch was no longer slipping away. His breathing slowed, steady and real. Color returned to his face in uneven waves, as if life itself were arguing its way back in. Every person in the room saw it at the same time, and no one knew how to explain it. The boy who had been restrained was suddenly no longer invisible. Authority faltered. Credentials meant nothing in the face of what was unfolding. The same hands that had grabbed, accused, and restrained now hesitated. Fear shifted directions. It was no longer about liability or protocol. It was about the possibility that prejudice had nearly killed a child. The father stood at the center of it all, watching the impossible happen in front of him. Weeks of exhaustion, grief, and trust in systems that promised answers crashed together in a single realization. The people he had empowered had failed, and the person he had been ready to punish had acted when no one else would. The room began to understand the cost of its assumptions. The child's eyes moved with intention. His body responded where it hadn't in months. Every small sign landed like a blow. This wasn't coincidence. This was intervention, and it came from someone the room had already decided didn't belong. The weight of that truth pressed down hard. Because this wasn't just a medical mistake, it was a moral one. The house had followed a hierarchy that rewarded silence and punished observation. It trusted titles over timing, reputation over reality. And in doing so, it nearly erased the one person who saw clearly enough to act. As the evidence stacked up and the accusations unraveled, the injustice stood exposed, raw and undeniable. The question was no longer what had happened in that room. It was whether anyone inside it was brave enough to admit why the warning had been ignored in the first place. When the noise finally faded, the truth remained, quiet, heavy, impossible to undo. The child on the couch recovered not because the system worked, but because someone outside it refused to stay silent. The crisis ended, but the illusion of fairness did not survive it. What unfolded inside that house changed more than one life. It exposed a pattern many prefer not to see. The boy who had been restrained walked away free, but not untouched. He had learned, far too early, how quickly help can be mistaken for threat when it comes from the wrong person. His mother returned to her work with a different posture, not smaller, but steadier, knowing she had nearly lost everything for trusting her instincts in a place that never trusted her in return. For the family at the center of the storm, relief came with a reckoning. Gratitude did not erase responsibility. The moment forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Expertise had failed and bias had filled the gap. Silence had almost done irreversible harm, and listening, real listening, had come just in time. This story is not rare. It doesn't live only in mansions or headlines. It unfolds in hospitals, schools, workplaces, and streets, where voices are weighed not by truth, but by race, status, and proximity to power, where warnings are dismissed until they come too late or from someone deemed acceptable. The real impact of this moment isn't just that a life was saved. It's the reminder of how close injustice comes to being permanent when no one challenges it. So the question lingers long after the screen fades to black. How many people have we already ignored? And how many more will it take before we finally learn to listen? If this story moved you, share it, talk about it, because awareness is the first step toward change, and silence has already cost too much.